please welcome back to the stage the Executive Director of Offshore Wind California, Adam Stern.
Welcome back, everyone, from lunch. Hope you had a nice time together, networking, and now the hits keep coming. This agenda is very full all the way till 5 o'clock with a break in between. This panel is all about going big on offshore wind for California, and in particular, the prospects for state and federal engagement. We have a great panel. I'm going to invite each of them to briefly introduce themselves and their sort of role in offshore wind development, either as a government agency or a developer. So I'm going to start on the far end here with Chuck Bonham.
Is it? Yep, sure enough. No button. Thank you, Adam. And it's true, my name's Chuck Bonham. And I am the director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And on one hand, I'm not really sure why I'm here, and I want to explain that in a moment. But on the other hand, I have a deep appreciation for why I'm here. Our department is the largest and oldest fish and wildlife state agency in America. We trace our roots back over 150 years ago to something called the Board of Fish Commissioners, created in the California Constitution. And our jurisdiction, our authority, is for every living plant and animal in the state, and boiled down, our mission is to save nature. So we have a role, and it'll be something we talk about over the course of this 45-minute conversation with those who are proponents of projects, those who are the workforce related to those proposed projects, our sister state agencies, our sister federal agencies. But here's the part that I really want to share that relates to, I don't exactly know why I'm here. So, I picked a quote that has a connection to fishing. So Norman MacLean, y'all may know, is an author. He wrote a famous book, A River Runs Through It. And in that book, he said something like, you can love something completely without completely understanding it. And of course, he was talking about the art of fly fishing, but I've been having a similar relationship just with who we are as people, what government is right now, the challenges that face us in the state, nationally, and globally. I love us completely, but I don't completely understand the period we find ourselves in living through together. So I want to, over the course of the conversation, share some of my own reflections on what it means to set your eyes on something large and persistently pursue it. I've been director of this department 14 years now, and I've seen a lot of energy development over those years, and I want to share some of my lessons with you while we have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Chuck. I think you should be the moderator because you have asked such good questions for all of us to think about. But let's switch now. Andrew Meredith from RWE. You have a great background, which I know you'll share a little bit about, and we're glad to have you here.
Thank you. I want to first thank everyone that's here after lunch. I know this is the most difficult panel to get back to watch, so thank you for showing up to listen to us talk for 45 minutes. My name is Andrew Meredith. I am the Labor Relations Director for RWE across the United States, but I'm also the market lead now in the state of California. We're really excited about a project that we're proposing on the North Coast on a lease area off of Humboldt County. In that area, I think for those of you that are not familiar with it, this is an area that has suffered significantly from industries coming in and not delivering on promises. And one of the things that I know our CEO, Sam Eaton, believes in wholeheartedly is that we want offshore wind to deliver benefits for the local communities. Coming out of the state building trades in my previous role, I have a deep connection with the plight of workers. And one of the things that I really loved about that role was the ability to elevate people to the middle class. This is what jobs and the construction trade unions do. And unfortunately, there's a lot of industries that we're seeing go away in the state of California, but they're making way for new ones like offshore wind. And I think as a development industry, the 5 leaseholders in the state of California understand the opportunity that we have here to deliver on that promise of good paying jobs, to deliver on that promise of economic benefits in the local community, but also to deliver on the promise that those jobs be local and that they be all inclusive. We want the workforces that build these projects up and down the state of California to be representative of the communities that they're going to be built in. And that's why I'm so excited about the work that we're doing in the offshore wind industry.
Thank you, Andrew. And now Elizabeth Huber from CEC.
Thank you, Adam. And it's a pleasure to be up here with two very distinguished gentlemen. I'm Elizabeth Huber, and I oversee the Siting Transmission Environmental Protection Division of the California Energy Commission. And I have to step back because we are who we are, and we do what we do because of the foundation, laid and planted for us. And I was blessed of having immigrant parents. My dad was a tool and die maker by trade, and came over here for a better life and opportunity after World War II. Yes, he was born and raised in Munich, Germany, not the place to be after the war. And he retired as a plant manager. He lived the American dream. He's my hero. And never had a college education, but had that foundation and set that foundation with me and my sisters, on how we collaborate together, how we look at the bigger picture. And in my role at the CEC, we are, what we like to say in the division is we're keeping the lights on today. And we oversee 76 thermal power plants that 50 megawatts or larger, and that become very important during peak load in the summer months. But we also, within the division, are taking all the data and information given to us from our colleagues at sister agencies, sister divisions within the CEC, and we're looking at how do we plan and implement for clean energy and electricity distribution by 2045. And so my division has a unit for ocean renewable energy led by Eli Harland and team that do a phenomenal job and are as busy as ever. And I know we'll talk a little bit more as we get into Q&A, but we're doing important work, and the path may be a little slower. And, it reminds me of the turtle and the hare. We may be the turtle right now, but good work is going on.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to go back to Chuck here and would love to get some reflections on some of the other types of energy resources that you've had some role in and helping to cite, and maybe going back to the early part of your leadership of DFW with utility solar and onshore wind.
Adam, the other thing that's been on my mind, and I've been in a philosophical mood, and I said this last week in a different conversation with a lot of folks. There's a Greek philosopher who once said, apparently, the only thing permanent is change. And first off, I can't see who's in the audience because of the lights on the stage. I may not know many of you, and my impression is you're in the middle of trying to navigate change as well. And there's ups, there's downs. It can feel like a hard left or right turn at any given moment. You're in the immediate looking right at what's in front of you. You have a line of sight through your front windshield. Contextually, it's your rear view mirror that's more 20/20 when you have hindsight. And I started as director in a transition from Governor Schwarzenegger to Brown, and I've lost count of how many secretaries of the Interior. And there was a similar mood or moment about renewable energy on the terrestrial side. There was an intense creativity, drive for innovation. Capital markets were flowing. People were thinking about the Mojave Desert region of California. There was constant concern Will this happen? Won't it happen? How could it happen? At that earlier moment, there was identical, bold vision being set by different voices, including the state of California. So, 2000-ish, 2010, 2015. And when you look back at that moment, sometimes it feels quaint, given the turmoil we live through now. But you look backwards and you realize how many megawatts, how many projects, how many difficult issues sorted out. And you ask yourself, well, if back then we had decided collectively to close shop, no longer stay involved, we wouldn't have done what we needed to do. And so now we're at a next phase in that region where we have more growth that will likely happen with renewable energy. And to pick a specific example, we also have a really ubiquitous native tree called the Joshua tree. It's iconic. It's on the back of the album, not the front. And it's across a range as big as much of the eastern seaboard. Our department thinks there's somewhere between 4 and 6 million of those trees. But when you look at all the peer-reviewed climate models, most of them tell you in somewhere between, say, 30 or 50 years, they may go extinct at the rate of which they're being cut. And that's in the very same place where we have dramatic housing needs, transportation, kind of re-envisioning our infrastructure, a strong desire to drive job creation and give hardworking men and women an opportunity. We have to build housing in this region. It's growing fast. How do you reconcile this? It's possible. And now, as we sit here in 2025, it's not perfect, but we have our first state law ever about an iconic native plant. It requires co-management with tribes. First time ever a state statute has said that. It creates the only in lieu fee payment program for a potential endangered species under state law for applicants and permittees. It creates a streamlined way to approve cutting a tree for dead and dying and fire risk reasons. And we're implementing it with bumps and trying to improve, but we wouldn't have had that creativity if 5 years before, 10 years before, 15 years before, you and your predecessors hadn't stayed the course. I think there are things analogous to where we find ourselves now on offshore wind.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're going to come back to some of those points you just made. Andrew, I want to ask your thoughts about community benefit agreements, what they mean, and as you're thinking ahead to what your company and your fellow leaseholders are going to do, especially in the north area, how is that taking shape, and how are you applying your experience in the roles you've had before this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So one of the biggest concerns I think that you hear from local communities when large industries come to town is trying to get an understanding of what it's going to actually mean for the everyday citizen. What is it going to mean for the cities and the counties that are kind of in that area? And I think with the offshore wind industry, it's been much more deliberative than it's been with other industries already. I think that's something that the industry can be proud of. But at the end of the day, figuring out what the CBAs need to look like really requires a lot of stakeholder engagements. And I think there's obviously always going to be more that we can do as developers, but I do take some pride in some of the stakeholder engagement that's already taken place on the North Coast and that has already taken place on the Central Coast. I think that will ultimately make these community benefit agreements better and more representative of what the residents of these communities want to do. I think it's important to acknowledge too that we're a transient industry when it comes to the construction phase. Like every other project will be. Construction workers come and go from project to project. But what's really important to us as an industry is making sure that we're building up lasting economic power in communities. And I think that was one of the reasons that we came to an agreement with the state building trades as early as we did on an MOU that will really dictate the hiring principles for work on our projects. We did it well over a decade before development activities are really going to kick off. But what it does is it allows the labor leaders in these local communities to open up more apprenticeship slots for local workers. It allows them to engage directly with tribal nations to make sure that some of those apprenticeship slots are prioritized for tribal members and other disadvantaged communities. And what that does is it places us as a key part of a bigger wheel, I guess, that is ultimately driving local economic development. No one industry, no one project is going to bring economic prosperity to an industry. It has to be a piece of a bigger puzzle. And I think that, executing agreements early provides the opportunity to do that. And we've done that on the construction side. I think, I saw some of our friends from labor here today already. I think they would attest to the fact that they're already seeing the ability to put more apprentices into their programs, and it's a direct result of negotiating agreements with developers and negotiating agreements with ports and with other entities. That's something that we're really proud of.
Thank you, Andrew. Elizabeth, you played an instrumental role in leading the implementation of the first obligations within AB 525 and oversaw a lot of the report writing and the ultimate issuance of the plan. And now you're also working on the implementation of AB 3. What have you learned along the way about working across the panoply of state agencies that we have in California? And as you look ahead to sort of the next steps, the next chapters, and the journey we're on, what have you learned? What do you wish to share now?
I think the first thing I learned is I was in great company, and we have the same phenomenal resources, but also have the same challenges. And once we laid that out and were able to talk about how we could maximize the resources that we had and what our collective needs were and our specific needs by the mandates of why our agencies exist, I think it was a very positive. I mean, we're talking 9 agencies, 11 and 12. If you start adding some of the smaller agencies that played a role in 1 or 2 of the final chapters, but how the mission is the same and how we care about the direction that our state's moving in, that we are protecting our natural resources while looking at economic opportunity. We are the 4th largest economy in the world, and that is done by the fact that the state has looked outside the box. We've been the leader in so many different areas of climate policy that other states or the federal government even followed suit. There's some pauses happening right now at the federal level, but that hasn't deterred what we're doing at the state level. I have positive conversations with my colleagues around these various agencies, and we're committed to the work. We've continued to have bi-weekly meetings with tribal governments. Our agency is providing support to the Coastal Commission on their fisheries working groups. We're working with state lands because of our work around the ports. CDFW team has been phenomenal. And so what I've learned is that we're here because of the passion and the belief that we really can move forward to be a self-sustaining state. And provide the electricity from clean resources to meet our future demand in the state. And we're in it together to make sure that happens.
Thank you. Chuck, could you expand a little more about your sort of philosophical musings of the moment we're in and what advice you have, not just for those of us here on the stage, but the group in the audience? There's a tremendous representation from the other state agencies here tonight. This afternoon, there are labor union representatives and NGOs. We've got a great diversity in the hall today, and I know they'd welcome your wisdom.
maybe they would. I mean, if they're being nice. And I would like to stick around afterwards if anyone wants to just have a conversation. Because part of this is about relationships. Nothing hard happens without relationships. So call me. My grandmother, I grew up in the South, used to say, I don't care what you call me, just call me. And my next thought is stay the course. California is not going away. There's plenty of stuff to do in 3 years. And I really love what my colleague to my left, your right, just said, that, you know, we are all part of a bigger puzzle. And allegedly, Socrates, on his trial for life and death, said, an unexamined life is not worth living. So you have a lot you need to examine right now. You have corporate pressure, financial decisions to make, but stay the course. A rising tide can lift all boats. I am very excited, even though it's not directly in my department's purview, this idea of benefits. Because my direct community of hardworking men and women who still make a living on the ocean fishing have been shut out of salmon fishing for 3 years in a row, a decision I've had to make. But underneath that, while the ocean is changing, their on-land infrastructure is a mess. It's 50 plus years, it's aging. If you're a commercial fishing person in Point Arena or somewhere else along the coast, you only have a few options for where to go to get your gas, get your ice. That is investment that may be lurking in Proposition 4. It may be investment that's driven by the leadership of labor to think about community benefits, and it'll be long lasting. And if I could, just one more story. My next story runs 20 years. We just finished the world's largest river restoration project ever in America. And we took down a series of dams in the Klamath River. It wouldn't have happened without tribal leadership. But it also involved the utility. Pacific Core, Berkshire Hathaway, Scottish Power, all had ownership of these assets over those 20 years. We worked through replacement energy, we worked through renewable energy across the grid, we worked through tribal justice and restorative justice. We got it done ahead of schedule and on budget, which is a lot of what I like to say to Caltrans when we're talking about big projects. But it involved Schwarzenegger, Brown, wouldn't have happened without Governor Newsom's leadership, Kitzhaber, Kulangoski, Governor Brown, Oregon, Kotek. Along the way, I feel like Forrest Gump. I met Gail Norton, Dirk Kempthorne, Ken Salazar, Sally Jewell, Ryan Zinke, David Bernhardt, Deb Haaland, all secretaries of the Interior. If we hadn't stuck with it, it wouldn't have happened. You have 3 years. Who knows what happens tomorrow? Who knows what happens 4 years from now? We've got plenty of work you can do directly with California. Rising tide lifts all boats. Stick with it.
Message. Thank you. Andrew, talk a little more about the preparations you're doing for the workforce that's going to be needed to bring offshore wind to reality. And you're ideally suited for the role you're in because of your prior experience heading up one of the largest unions in our state. How do you see this taking shape, and particularly since we still don't know for sure when construction is going to begin? There's a lot of things between now and then, but how are you working to prepare the workforce for this big opportunity?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge first that the building trades do a really good job of preparing the workforce as it is. I think the role that the developer plays is, early engagement and partnership, which allows them the opportunity to, as I mentioned earlier, bring more individuals into their programs. I don't know if Chris Hannon is still here, the president of the State Building Trades, but I think what he would argue is they really have an unlimited capacity to bring people into their program if there was an unlimited capacity of work to put all of these individuals on. They can grow their training programs, they can grow their training centers to accommodate an exponential increase in workers. What really holds everything back is opportunities by partnering with developers and just looking at the overall economy. So I think for us, understanding that we really don't have the role of telling the trades what they need to do to prepare the workers. It's helping create the environments where more workers can be trained, knowing that there will be a job at the end of the equation. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge too that, there's been a lot of negative news about offshore wind, since January of this year for a lot of different reasons. But I think there's a lot of things in California to be proud of too. When developers bid into the market here in 2022, there was a lot of uncertainty around things like transmission, around port improvements, around offtake certainty. And these are things that the state of California has already addressed to some degree. We're seeing clarity about transmission, which is really important for us on the North Coast, because without transmission expansion, there will be no offshore wind projects on the North Coast. It's important to point out too, as it relates to the North Coast, there really haven't been substantial increases to capacity or geographical expansion in the North Coast since around World War II. So it's needed, regardless of offshore wind. There's still communities, including tribal communities, that struggle with power uncertainty. And it's hard to imagine, I'm an Army guy. I went to Iraq in 2005. I saw what parts of a country that would be deemed third world look like. It's hard to imagine that in California, there's still communities that don't know for sure that they're gonna have power 365 days a year. As it relates to port improvements, the voters in California stepped up like they always do with the passage of Prop 4. There's substantial funding in that for port improvements, which again de-risks another part of the equation for us. And then the CPUC dedicating 7.6 gigawatts of procurement gives some offtake certainty for us as developers too. These are all meaningful steps that the state has taken. There's still things that need to be done. I think conversations around how we permit jobs a little bit easier, permit projects a little bit easier need to happen. I know that this is something that the governor and his administration have talked a lot about, and I think as a development industry, we're looking forward to the opportunity to participate in those conversations too. We're doing permit streamlining for projects like sports arenas in California. We should be doing them for projects that are delivering on our climate goals too. Firmly believe that. But back to the overall question about the workforce, coming out of the role as the president of the State Building Trades, I know that the training infrastructure in this state has the ability to grow and meet the demands of any industry, including offshore wind.
Yeah, thank you so much. Elizabeth, one of the things that impressed me in the way CEC coordinated the AB 525 planning process was the extent of consultations with stakeholders of all types. It made the process take longer, but what do you think are the lasting benefits of that? And as we move into the next chapter of the next few years, how will the CEC and your fellow agencies capitalize on that legacy?
Great question, and I have to start by saying I think we were already seeing the state capitalize on that work. We stopped counting workshops, meetings, individual conversations, consultations, listening sessions when we hit 200. It just kept on going and going. And this strategic plan, the CEC gets credit for the final version of it, the adoption by our commissioners, but again, it was a collective of partner agencies, but all of you out here in this room and your colleagues who aren't here today who participated in all those public processes that we put out there. With that said, we concluded the strategic plan with some comprehensive recommendations and early stage activities that need to happen, midterm and long term. And when you look at Prop 4, when it passed by 60% of the vote, the key things in that we have to administer at the CEC and moving those monies to where they need to go, it comes from that strategic plan. There is a plan in place, and we continue to build on the 525. We talked about staging and integration as a near-term need for initial deployment of this industry. That is what is highlighted as priority in Prop 4. We talk about continuation of engagement, activities that all three of us have already mentioned, in our earlier comments. And then you start talking about midterm, workforce development, having these workplace training facilities near the projects, near in the communities for local opportunity to build the workforce there. Then you go into assembly and manufacturing that's in Prop 4. We have AB 3 to complement that, and how do we get to 50 to 65% of all assembly and manufacturing done within the state? Again, the economics, the workforce opportunity. My dad, again, I'm a product of someone that was in the manufacturing industry forever. And then we're looking at long term. We need the vessels. So we're looking at operations and maintenance. This is all laid out in the strategic plan, and it's all laid out in Prop 4 and in other pieces of legislation that will help inform us to the next steps to be ready for offshore wind. And I want to also add, being, living and breathing permitting. I mean, we have an in-house CEQA team of 30 plus engineers, scientists, environmental technicians. And one thing that they collectively say as we do compliance and oversight of these firm resources, offshore wind is probably the closest to a firm resource. And so when we're looking at reliability, long-term resource adequacy, we see that offshore wind plays a role, and it is part of our long-term plan. And I just want to emphasize that. We wouldn't be here today. I would not be running over to the legislature to a budget meeting after this to talk about the good works that all of you and my colleagues here have been doing to get us where we are compared to where we were 10 years ago.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I want to shift gears to a little different public issue in terms of perceptions about offshore wind. There's been some polling over the last few years that at least statewide, something like 70 or even in some cases 80% of the public support offshore wind in California. It's pretty unusual for any resource. And yet, I think all of us know that when it gets down to individual projects, there's going to be opposition. There's already evidence of that. I want to start with Chuck. What are you hearing about people's reactions to offshore wind? And based on that, what do you think all of us should be preparing for?
At the same time, Adam references polling that consistently shows overwhelming support for offshore wind development off California's magical 1,100-mile coastline. We also see consistent year-over-year polling, which tells us when you ask Californians, do you care about the ocean and our coast, it's overwhelmingly yes. In the environmental kind of conservation space, it arguably might be the most firm, non-changeable, kind of non-partisan thing that shows up in the polling I'm privy to. People love it. So I think when you get to individual projects, people move from how they might answer general polling questions to the struggle of reconciling really important values. And I think it's important, but also very doable to find that reconciliation. Now here, much of what you'll be doing is way out of a viewshed, relatively. We will have, when we get there, gone through probably some of the most rigorous, transparent scientific work in the planet about the relationships in the ocean between species, spatial planning, your possible developments. If we remain transparent about that information, if we remain willing to hear the critic, if we keep trying to grow the radical middle of folks who can work through hard problems to get to solutions, I think we'll get this done. It, in part, depends on personalities like Andrew's, Elizabeth's, y'all's approach. I've seen projects start where they come to the regulator at the very last minute and they say, I got no room, no flex, I owe the bank tomorrow. I've seen projects do the exact opposite. When you still have the so-called blank whiteboard, you've already started to develop your relationship. You've already started to think about footprint and design. You've already tried to roster who may feel impacted, therefore must be dealt with at a communal level. In that sense, you're way ahead of my experience with terrestrial renewable 15 years ago, trying to figure out how to build in the desert.
Thank you. Andrew, what are you hearing up in Humboldt area where you work from the public?
I think, there's a desire to have more clarity on what this industry is actually going to look like. I think across the globe, this is an industry that's emerging right now. There's still not a lot of certainty about what floating foundations will look like, for example, what the size of turbine assemblies will look like. So I think there's a lot of questions about that. I think we're still really in this survey development type phase where the industry as a whole across the globe is trying to understand what are the impacts, what are the best ways to mitigate them. And I think we're getting that question quite a bit on the North Coast. I don't think it's probably any dissimilar than what they're hearing on the Central Coast as well. I think there's also a question of, is this actually an industry that we're going to see come to fruition? And for the reasons that I explained a few minutes ago, I'm really bullish on offshore wind in California. I think the fact that there are still developers that are engaged in light of some of the negativity from the federal level right now speaks to that. California is a huge market. As Elizabeth explained, we're the 4th largest economy in the world. We're the largest subnational economy in the world. And there's a lot of opportunities that come with that. I think there's also a little bit of a responsibility too. When industries emerge like this, you do it the right way and you set the example for the rest of the globe. And I think California will ultimately do that. I think we're taking steps in the right direction now. And I think the 5 leaseholders that are participating are glad to be playing a role in that as well.
Yeah, thank you. And Elizabeth, your take on public perceptions of offshore wind from your experience right now.
I have to say, I have to ponder a second because I'm trying to see where I've heard negativity. I was at the Oceanic Network hosts also their annual IPF and in Virginia, and what was interesting is the comments are always about, the numbers just aren't the same as they have been in past years, and what is that signifying? And we were, chatting while waiting for the bus, to come pick us up and take us to the next activity, and just talking to others and their perception. And I still remember this gentleman from Singapore who indicated that, to me, it looks like the industry, the workforce, the unions, we're all represented here. but we all had to pick the straw, whether it was the shortest or the longest, as who gets to go. So I see the commitment still there. We're just being a little bit conservative about it from a larger approach. But everyone I've talked to at this event, at last month's event, the commitment is there. They see the success offshore wind has had in with our partners, in Europe and in Asia. We've worked hard to establish memorandums of understanding to work and collaborate with these companies and these countries. And so they don't see it changing. We're maybe being more strategic on the direction or on how fast or slow we're going, but it's still moving forward, and people do not feel discouraged, especially by California and the signals we're given.
As we move into the last few minutes of our program, I want to sort of encapsulate a few questions that have come in from the audience. I'm afraid we won't get to all of them, but there is a general comment about permitting processes and the terms like streamlining or rationalizing, which is, I think, what Assembly Member Petrie Norris said just a little bit ago on this stage. Starting with Chuck, your thoughts on how do we do permitting in a way that honors our commitment to the state's environmental heritage while moving forward with an important clean energy resource that I think at least everyone in this room would agree, the state urgently needs?
Yes, and I feel particularly qualified to offer my views on this idea of permit efficiency and streamlining, having been around it some time. We can all get better. Conventional wisdom tends to suggest the responsibility exists exclusively with the regulator, and I actually think there's a lot of two-way street around efficiencies. You don't need to be government to be bureaucratic. Bureaucracy comes from largeness. Most of the applicants we're dealing with themselves are conglomerates. So how we manage ourselves together, the ability to have the workforce in these entities to do the work, and the often regular consultation and communication based on relationships in all the reviews, McKinsey, everyone else, those are some of the common denominators that come out of how do you do permitting faster. So this is very doable. I adopt Andrew's remarks. I mean, it used to be the case that if you wanted to do restoration, which involves bulldozers anymore because we've so dramatically degraded the landscape, we had to do a CEQA document for a project whose sole purpose was to recover salmon habitat. About 4 years ago, the governor and the legislature created a statutory exemption in CEQA for habitat restoration projects. We've been doing it for stadiums, as Andrew mentioned. It's time we do them for projects we want. And then the last plug I'd make is one of a plea for empathy. So Andrew, you asked about who's concerned. I will tell you at an emotional state, our men and women who fish in the ocean, many of them are at the end of their tenure. There's a generational change happening. They're worried the generation coming behind them won't be there, that people won't choose to do this for a living. The ocean has turned upside down in many of the climate disruption dynamics. Things they've always counted on fishing for to put their kids through college, I closed down early or shut down late. Crab. They've lost salmon. So they're coming to this engagement with you, particularly the applicants, the proponents, just worried about their future. And there's a way to work through that, but it requires the openness, the inclusivity, and we can still get this done, notwithstanding their concerns.
Thank you, Chuck and Andrew and Elizabeth, for a very stimulating discussion. Please join me in a round of applause for our panelists.